we're looking at a really cool promise. God promises that there's power in your faith. There's power in faith, right? And we want to unpack this a bit. We're going to look at another woman who has this really special encounter with Jesus. Last week, we looked at this woman who said that the Bible described her as a sinner, and it was shocking that Jesus was allowing her to. She was crying and pouring out oil and anointing his feet, and this Pharisee was like, "I can't believe you would let her do that. She's blah, blah, blah." And now we're going to look at this woman who, again, Jesus is going to have a very distinctive response toward her. Again, we see Jesus facing these societal norms and having this countercultural reaction. He pushes back against the flaws and the sinful traditions inherent in the society. And the way he does it brings incredible healing and blessing to this woman. There's a few more things we can say, but I want to just get right into the text, and we'll draw out some more insights from there. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 34. So Mark chapter 5, and you can just scroll down to 24, or you'll see the words up on the screen behind me as well. All right. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And Jesus looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So this story has all the hallmarks of a great moment. We have this woman who's been dealing with this condition for more than a decade, and she's absolutely desperate, looking for a solution, looking for a rescue or a cure. And then she encounters Jesus, and there's this miraculous moment, and she finds the healing that she's been searching for. I cannot fathom this situation this woman was living in, to be dealing with what the Jewish law would have called ceremonially unclean. For 12 years, she would have been kind of this outcast, right? And she spends everything she has in search for a solution, only for her health to not get better, but to in fact get worse. The text doesn't specify exactly what she was diagnosed with. We know that because this bleeding had lasted for more than, or as many as 12 years consistently, that this was probably not a typical period or like a normal routine, just like menstrual bleeding. But a lot of scholars will agree that this had to be some type of uterine bleeding, possibly similar to what we know as endometriosis, a really, really challenging, difficult condition for women. And I can only imagine how isolating that must have been for her. I mean, there's this obvious physical pain that comes from just bleeding in general. In my limited experience, I have scraped knees and paper cuts, but I can't compare that to what it must have felt like to be bleeding for 12 years and the discomfort of that. And then there's a crushing social pressure on this woman as well. Like I mentioned earlier, this Jewish law would have made her unclean, is the term, because of her blood. Now, there is some science that supports this idea of, hey, there's germs and we shouldn't come into contact with foreign blood. That's totally agreeable. But there's an additional sense of shame that seems to be put on women in this area of their lives. I mean, you look at this idea that for some reason a woman talking about her period has this sense of taboo or shame. We don't want to talk about it, despite the fact that this is a regular thing that happens. That's part of an incredible process that brings life into the world. Yet on the flip side, we'll talk about men in battles and war who spill blood for the reason of taking a life. And we call them heroes. And we make movies about it. and it's applauded. Even now in our current culture, we can get a little uncomfortable, like, oh, that's kind of a weird thing to talk about in church, and he's saying that on stage. And we're trying hard now in our society to be polite and to have good social etiquette. Imagine how much more the social pressure would have been on this woman thousands of years ago when there were actual laws put in place to segregate her and keep her out of the temple and ensure that she couldn't have a job. She likely wouldn't be able to be married. If you even came in contact with this woman, physical contact with this woman, you would be considered unclean. And for 7 days, you'd have to go through this bathing process and you couldn't be a part of society. The pressure and the anxiety, just so much on this woman for a condition she couldn't fix, for something that wasn't even maybe really her fault. And you begin to wonder, okay, after 12 years of constant bleeding, how much longer can she even survive? I mean, your body does make new blood, but that's going to take a toll on your health. Yet despite all of these things, the story makes it clear that she still had faith in Jesus as the answer, that Jesus could be the one to help her come or help her be healed. And it's an interesting thing because if you imagine this woman set in this time period, there's no way that people would look at her and say, wow, you've been dealing with this for 12 years. That's a great example of someone we want to be like, or that's an example of really good faith. More than likely, people would assume, and we see this a lot of times in the New Testament, if something bad was happening to you, especially for a long period of time, it's because you were a bad person. It's because you had some unrepentant sin. You deserved this. I had a math teacher in middle school teach me that a bad thing happening to a bad person is a good thing. It was like a negative times a negative is a positive. That's how she taught it. But I still remember that now, And I think it's funny because it comes from this way of thinking. And that really wasn't true because what Jesus does is he proclaims this woman and her faith is what's healed her. So we begin to see a total different thing. We must have a faith that's willing to make sacrifices and endure through any amount of discomfort and uncertainty. This is our first point. Faith requires sacrifice. Faith requires sacrifice. I mean, by definition, faith is going to move us to a place of filling in the gap of uncertainty. If we're confident about something, if we're totally aware and we know something is factually true, we don't need faith. Faith tends to fill in the gaps of our lack of understanding. Faith takes us to the place we wouldn't go otherwise without the faith. It's going to require sacrifice. And I don't say these words lightly because by definition, sacrifice requires the surrender of something valuable or the participation in something challenging. If it wasn't, then it would just be a regular action. This woman had already sacrificed all of her monetary resources in search of a solution. And in one act of faith in Jesus, she gets pressed a little bit harder to surrender perhaps even more of her pride, dignity, maybe even some of her safety. We see this because in the crowd, again, remember the laws. She's ceremonially unclean. Under no circumstances would she ever be allowed to be in this large of a public gathering or public setting because she's obviously going to touch people. All these people are going to become tainted or contaminated. And yet she pushes through knowing that a lot of these people probably know who she is. I mean, for 12 years, she's not been allowed into the temple. For 12 years, she's not been invited to dinners or to meals or to birthday parties or to whatever. She's that weird person that everyone knows about that's not, you can't be around her. She's still bleeding. It's crazy. Stay away from her. And now she's pushing her way through the crowd, risking some possible consequences, definitely more social pressure. And I have to think, at least some insults would come her way. But she thinks, if only I touch even just the hem, just the end of Jesus' robe, I'll be healed. And if that wasn't enough, Jesus kind of steps it up a little bit. The moment she touches his robe, she's healed, right? The Bible says she's healed instantly. But then Jesus stops the crowd and says, hey, who touched me? The Bible says he felt the power leave him. And it's an interesting thing because Jesus is 100% God. He's 100% man. And so some people might say, okay, well, the guy writing this, Mark, was just trying to show some of Jesus' human side when he says, "Who touched me?" That's possible. Maybe Jesus really didn't know. I think more than likely Jesus is establishing an opportunity to invite this woman into a confession of faith. Who touched me? And she's there in the crowd, covertly hidden, knowing like, oh my gosh, it was 100% me. And I know that he's talking to me because I know what just happened. Would she dare to reveal herself? Would she dare to make her plan public? Originally it was supposed to be secret. She was just trying to sneak in, just touch the robe, not even say, hey, Jesus, help me. Nope. She's just trying to be sneaky about it, trying to keep it all covert. And now, is she willing to make the sacrifice in faith to come before Jesus? And it says she was coming in fear and trembling and laid before him and told him the whole truth. Was she in fear and trembling because of the crowd? Was it because of the public declaration of faith she was about to give? Maybe she was just terrified of the awesome power of God. Whatever it may be, we see her challenge to do something that I think many of us would agree is a bit scary. She lays before Jesus and confesses her faith and her whole plan, thinking, if I just touched your robe, I knew that I could be healed because you're God. I'm adding some words here. But imagine if you just had to go even to the mall or to the Riverwalk and talk with people and share your faith. How easy would that be for you to do? Or is that something that's like, whoa, that's kind of tough for me? Here is this woman already kicked out and unwanted by society, now publicly displaying her faith and putting it out there in front of the whole crowd. It's a massive sacrifice. And in this woman's desperate example, I'm reminded of a powerful truth that adversity reveals the authenticity of our faith. Often when things are getting really, really hard and really, really tough, it reveals the depth and the direction of our faith. Even Satan himself knows this, and he mentions it to God when he's having this discussion. He goes to God and he's asking God for permission, because he's not as powerful as God. He has to ask for permission to tempt this man named Job. Job was a devout follower. He loved God. He always followed God. He tried to be obedient to everything God asked him to do. Here's how this discussion goes. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land, but stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So Satan's having this discussion with God, and he's saying, well, of course Job loves you. Of course he's obedient. Everything's going great. He's successful. He's wealthy. Life is good for Job. Of course he loves you. But bring in some challenges. Maybe he gets laid off at work. Maybe that credit card gets maxed out and another bill comes in. Maybe some of the wealth goes away. Start taking away some of the good, positive, happy, easy, good things, and he'll turn. His faith will crumble, and he'll curse you to your face. Well, spoiler alert, if you haven't read that story of Job, Satan loses that battle too. But the point is still pretty valid, right? And it comes to this kind of like challenging sense of like, is that true of us, right? Could that be said of my faith? I think we look back to our recent COVID pandemic with businesses that were closing and public gatherings were limited. Churches often couldn't meet, and people began to panic. We begin to locate the places where our faith is most centered. You see, nothing about God changed during that time. God was still the same God, but all the circumstances around us changed. We can simply ask ourselves, what thing do I fear most? What thing do I most fear losing? Or what thing in my life is the one thing that if I lost, life wouldn't feel worth living? Whatever your answer is to that question, that's probably the thing that you put most of your faith in. That may very well be the God of your life. That's the most treasured, valuable thing you have. I know for me, during the pandemic, it was revealed to me being stuck at home. I don't think I realized how much I rely on, as an extrovert, just being around people to help me to feel good, to help me have energy and feel positive about life. As long as I'm with people, I feel good. And when all that was taken away, I was just like depressed and just grumpy and didn't feel, I was like, man, I have not allowed God to have this space in my life as much as I thought he did. It was a challenge for me. And I feel challenged by the faith of this woman who, after 12 years of hopelessness, still believed that there was an answer, that there could be a cure, and that it was found in this man, Jesus. Quick history lesson. Jesus was not the only person to show up who said, hey, I'm a prophet. Hey, I'm here for God. Hey, I'm going to do all these great things. I'm a messianic figure. There were other people before Jesus who did this, and they were killed for it. And nothing ever happened. You don't know about any of those guys because their movement stopped. Nothing came from it. She could have easily said, you know what, here's just the newest guy coming through town. I've seen them all. I've spent the last 12 years talking to the best experts and the best medical solutions. I'm not even going to waste my time with this guy. But for whatever reason, something was different about Jesus. Some report she heard may have changed her mind. Something in her began to say, there is hope, there is faith that this man will have the cure for me. That I'm willing to risk all of the additional public humiliation in order to find that cure in Jesus. If you find within yourself that your faith maybe isn't quite where you think it needs to be, let me encourage you. Faith is a gift. In Ephesians 2, 8-9, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that none may boast. God grants you the faith to believe in God. Our ability to even love God is only made possible through a God who loved you first. And this isn't about us having a self-pity party. It's about us saying, wow, I cannot believe how good God is, that he would make it possible that I could even know a God like him, that I could even know the depth of his love. That's how good God is. Yes, we want to grow our faith. Yes, we want to develop it. But more importantly than the strength of your faith is the object of your faith. Our second point this morning, the object of your faith is more important than the strength of your faith. Kind of a lengthy point. Sorry, I was trying to get it smaller. That's the best I could do. When you read the story of the woman, and she has this idea that she just needs to touch the fabric on Jesus' clothes and she'll be healed. It kind of comes off a little bit like mystical or like a magic trick or something. And she wasn't the only person who had this kind of way of thinking. Later on, we'll study in the book of Acts that people believed that this follower named Peter, a follower of Jesus, they believed that he had such an anointing, he had such a power from God that they began to lay people out on the streets, people who were sick and had injuries and needed healing. They'd lay him on the side of the road, hoping that when Peter walked by, his shadow, like not even Peter touching them, but his shadow would actually heal them. That was how people were thinking, which is kind of a little silly when you consider, like, well, what if it's lunchtime? Like, what if it's noon and there is no shadow? Do people just not get healed? Like, sorry, or a cloud comes over at the wrong time? Like, is God's power somehow limited because the shadow didn't quite get 100% of the person or 51%? Like, how is that? No, like that's not quite the best, most accurate understanding of how God works, which gives us a little bit of reason to maybe question the depth of this woman's faith. And so perhaps it's not her spiritual maturity that brings her healing. You see, it's not the strength of her faith, but the object of her faith that's most important. Let me illustrate this another way. Trey, can you do me a favor? Can you go upstairs and go get Tobin and have her come down real quick? And then Seth, I want to invite you up here really quick. Do a quick little object lesson. These are fun things. Seth's a super cool guy, good friend. Seth's been helping out at Lake Avenue since before October, since before we even started. And as you can tell, fine specimen of a young man, jacked, super, super strong. Obviously works out more than, some of y'all. I'm catching up a little bit. I'm 34 though. I'm old. I'm over the hill. Here's what we're going to do. We want to talk about how the object of your faith is more important than just the strength of your faith. So I'm going to have my daughter come up here in just a second, and we're going to have a little challenge. So we're going to pretend that their muscle mass, we're going to see my daughter in a second. She's pretty good. She's a good soccer player. We're going to pretend your muscle mass is your ability is the strength of your faith, right? And then we're going to look at this. Let me just grab it real quick. Yeah. You can just grab the top of it. What's up, Tobin? Welcome, welcome. This is Tobin, avid soccer player, fun lover extraordinaire. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a contest between Tobin, here you go, and Seth. They got to pick up these weights. So we got these 10-pound weights here. We're going to pretend, show us your muscles real quick. Strong. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. We can grab the little one. We're going to pretend that your muscles are your ability to believe, and your rope that you're going to pull the weight up with is the object of your faith. It's what you're believing in to be able to pull up the weight, all right? So Tobin, let's see if we can get yours through here. Don't pull up yet. So you got this nice little rope here. And then hold on, we got to fix your paper chain. Like this woman who was willing to go do all this stuff to meet Jesus. I need to have faith like her. Or you'll hear this really cool story about a young boy named David, and he has this faith to stand up in battle against this giant of a man named Goliath. And he has this incredible faith and says, no, today God's going to deliver you to my hands. And he throws a rock and kills him. And he's like, I went, you know. And we're like, man, I want to have the faith like David so I can slay giants and do awesome things. You see, more importantly than imitating their level of faith, what's most important is we want to follow the focus of their faith, which was in Jesus alone. The object of your faith. Who are you putting your faith in? Your spouse, your kids, your career. No disrespect to my mom if she's watching, but my mom used to always say, I got my house. I finally got my house. It's the most important thing to me. And I'm like, what if it burned down? She's like, how dare you say that? But she moved eventually. She got a new house. And even these material things, don't put all your faith in that. Instead, put your faith in Jesus, because even a small amount, when put and focused on Jesus, God alone, you gain access to incredible strength and blessing. And for the woman in this story, it was never really about touching the robe of Jesus. That's not what healed her. It was the fact that she said, this man who's come to town, this Jesus, he is the one who can bring me healing. He's the one who has the answer. I'm going to go to him. Despite the fact that she thought just the robe would be enough, her focus was on God. And it brought her incredible blessing. And this is what brings us to our final point this morning, that we must understand the reward and the value of our faith. Our final point this morning, the value of your faith is eternal. The value of your faith has eternal significance. It is everlasting. As you read through the Bible, you'll begin to notice a pattern that happens. Someone will come to God or will come to Jesus with a request of some sort, and And often God will answer that request in one way or another. But usually what happens is God also answers an entirely different need that the person isn't even asking for. Like there's a story of this paralyzed man and his friends tear a hole in the roof of this house where Jesus is sitting in because they can't, it's too crowded. And they lower their friend down in hopes that this Jesus, this man, will be able to help him and he can walk again. He won't be paralyzed. And it's true. Jesus does heal the man. He actually does get up and he walks out of the house in this miraculous thing. But before that, he says to him, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Jesus forever changes the eternal destination of this man. Something he wasn't even asking for. He even realized that he was talking to the God who could forgive sins. I think he simply believed that this man was powerful and there was reason to have faith in him. It was just a little bit of faith. He was just starting out. And even with the story with this woman, who I somewhat question a little bit her concept of, well, I just got to touch his robe. Even her, she wanted healing. She wanted a cure. And she got that. She did. But more importantly, when Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease," we realize there's something much, much bigger happening here. Her faith is going to go well beyond just this one momentary cure. Two quick subpoints here. Authentic faith establishes a relationship with God. When we have this faith that is truly authentic, we're going to create a new relationship with God, one we didn't have before. I hope you notice that Jesus called her daughter. If you've ever tried to count in the New Testament how many times Jesus is talking with someone and he says to them, "Daughter," he calls them, he gives them the name daughter. I'll give you a head start. It's once. It's this time. This is the only time that Jesus says to someone, "Daughter." And consider that this is a woman who's been rejected by society for 12 years. Her only identity has been unwanted, undesired, untouchable, unclean. And Jesus has the audacity to say, "No, your daughter." Just consider the weight and the impact of an eternal, everlasting God who calls you son or calls you daughter, who's changing your identity, who's changing the relationship and inviting you into this familial place where you now have access to someone who calls you their child. An identity that is unchanging across eternity. Jesus has welcomed her into his family. It's this new relationship that comes and it's born out of your faith in God. You're his. You're his child. You're his son. You're his daughter. Another last little subpoint here. Authentic faith is permanent with God. You see, we can trust the eternal nature of this relationship because of how Jesus responds and what he continues to say after calling her daughter. In English, when you're reading the Bible, we saw in the verse, there's two different phrases, right? The first one is, "made you well." Your faith has made you well. And the other phrase was, "be healed." Be healed of your disease. So we have these two phrases. And in English, it's clearly different. But we have to wonder, is Jesus repeating himself? Like, why these two seemingly similar phrases? But when we're studying the Bible, I always want to remind you, ask questions. Say, okay, well, why is this different? If he was saying that you're well and then you're healed, aren't those the same things? The Bible is originally, at least this part of the Bible, the New Testament, was written in Greek. And so we can actually, once you ask the question, why are these different? Well, we can actually go look at the original language and say, what did the translators who took it from Greek into English, what were they seeing? What did they read that led them to say, we need two different phrases? Here's what they read. So the first word for "made you well" is sesokien. Sesokien. It comes from the Greek word sazo or sezo. And that's a word often used in the Bible. If you go to like blueletterbible.org, or I think it's .org, or you have like a Greek Bible that you're really good at studying, maybe you know Greek, then you can look up that word and say, hey, this is a word, sezo, that's frequently used to mean rescue, or more specifically, salvation. So in this case, we could even translate, Jesus is saying your faith has saved you. The other word is hyges, and that's actually an adjective. The first word, seisokian, is a verb. So there are two different words. The second one, the adjective describing a condition. The first one, a verb, that we could actually translate as saved you, but it goes a little bit deeper than that because Jesus uses the perfect tense, which means this verb has a present effect present impact with ongoing effects into the future. So now we're recognizing, wait a second, this verb, this made you well, this saving that has taken place isn't just a momentary physical saving. There is something unique and distinctive about this salvation that continues on into the perpetuity, into the future. So now we're beginning to say that in both perhaps physical and spiritual realms, through her faith, she has been made well. There is an eternal significance to her faith. The outcast woman, this nameless character in the Bible, is now remembered thousands of years later for her faith in Jesus. In fear and trembling, she fell before Jesus, publicly in front of everyone, confessing her faith. She thought, if I just touch the fabric and the hem of his clothes, that'll be enough. Maybe her faith was a little bit thin, but the object, the focus of her faith in Jesus brought incredible healing. And when he says, daughter, your faith has made you well, she begins to recognize the permanence of this encounter, that her faith has eternal value. Friends, there is power in your faith because of the one you have put your faith in. If your faith is in Jesus, there is strength there. There is stability there. If you have elected to put your faith in anything else, I caution you. Everything else is sinking sand. Jesus used a story, said, it's like building your house on sand, and when the waves came, it crushed everything. The foundation was never that solid. But to build your house on the rocks, the solid foundation of Jesus Christ, the wind and the waves came, but the house stood. Whether it be our sin or our circumstances, we see that the old law of being unclean and you can't enter the temple for fear that you would desecrate or stain or tarnish the purity of God. We see that all that's changed because Jesus comes as the new temple, right? And what happens is we realize that when we approach Jesus with all of our messiness, with all of the stuff going on in our life, it's not us who's making Jesus dirty. It's Jesus who is making us clean. Don't be afraid to bring it all to Jesus. Don't fear that putting your faith in him is going to let you down. He will never fail you. He will never lead you astray. Lastly, Jesus says to her, go in peace. And it's such a cool, simple phrase. And I think it extends beyond the simple connotation of peace that we think of when something that exists in the absence of war or violence. I think he's talking about the shalom peace, this peace that comes from a right relationship with God. When you're in the right standing with God, when you're in that familial relationship with God, where the world can be swirling around you, there can be chaos going left and right and all sorts of crazy things happening. But because you are made complete in God, because your faith has you, you are secure. It doesn't mean that hard things aren't going to come. It doesn't mean you're not going to feel hardship, but it means that in the ultimate end, when all of it comes together, there is hope for you because your faith has eternal value. You are deeply loved. You can come to Jesus and recognize that there is power in your faith.